As photographers and videographers, the only tool we have to work with when creating our products, our still images or our video, is light. It's the only tool we have to work with. So you would think that photographers and videographers would be particularly keen on understanding the way that light actually moves and operates. But in fact, in my experience, nothing could be further from the truth. Photographers get nearly queasy when talking about light, well, at least many of them do. They get scared of talking about a light source that they're placing, man-made lights, and of controlling the way that light looks on a subject. And this means that they start making really bad mistakes regarding light, light placement, light sources, and lighting decisions in lighting video and lighting portraits and events. So what we're going to do in this channel is spend 5 videos talking about light, the way that it moves, the way that we shape it. And in fact, when I teach lighting and portraiture and lighting of events and other types of situations to my students, the way that I teach it is I say that there are in fact 5 individual characteristics of light that describe its behavior in your stills and in your video. And if you understand these 5 characteristics of light, you understand any given light source. In fact, if I call something a photographic light source, I specifically mean I can control these 5 characteristics. And just so that you're not rooting around and trying to find them, let me just give them to you up front. The 5 characteristics of light for photography and video purposes are, in no particular order, its brightness, its specularity, its light contrast, its position, and its color temperature. Those are the 5 characteristics of light. And over the course of 5 videos, we're going to examine each one of them. And today's video is going to be about brightness. So let's jump right into that. The brightness of a light source is really what exposure decisions we would make on the camera for that light source to be not overexposed or underexposed in your given piece of still or video content. In other words, what exposure settings do we set the camera to so that the light looks good? What I want to point out about that is very common for people to say, oh, I'm terrified of using flash because as soon as I put that on my camera, I'm adding light and I'm going to blow out my exposure. But this, of course, is nonsense. If you are indoors and your camera is taking good pictures indoors and you walk outside, you're dealing with quite a bit more light. But of course, your camera can adjust. The same thing is true of video lights or strobes or flashes. So just because we add light to the environment does not mean that the exposure will be brighter. It means that the camera needs to adjust, either with aperture, shutter speed, or ISO. The most important of those 3 when talking about lighting a scene is your aperture, because we actually describe the brightness of a light source through aperture. But let's get to that in a more roundabout way. It is common for people to believe that brightness of a light source is a fixed characteristic. In other words, that it would be meaningful to say this light source is 1200 lumens. And in fact, some video lights are actually described in their packaging by the number of lumens they produce. But for photographic purposes, this is meaningless. We do not talk about light sources as just an aperture or just lumens. In fact, what we talk about is an aperture at a distance, meaning that I would set an aperture value of some given amount, say f8, if the light source is some distance away. But moving the light source will necessitate changing the aperture. This makes intuitive sense when you think about it. If I think about any light source, the farther away it is from a subject, the dimmer the exposure it's putting onto that subject. We call this light fall off, and that describes the way that light is dimmer on a subject the farther apart the two are. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But first, let me come back to this idea of aperture at a distance. Why is it we describe light sources as apertures at given distances? The distances makes sense, of course, but why aperture? Why not shutter speed? Why not ISO? This comes from the world of working with strobe lighting equipment. Now, with strobe lighting equipment, it's not uncommon for us to think that it produces light during a given exposure, but that's not actually true. In fact, there is something that is called the flash duration of any given strobing piece of equipment. This is the period of time it actually emits light. So there's a lot of variety in this, of course, but you can think of initial numbers that you'll run into a lot as somewhere between a 16,000th of a second and a 32,000th of a second, meaning it's producing light for only a 16,000th of a second, briefer than the top shutter speed of most cameras. As a result, if I was shooting a photograph at a 200th of a second shutter speed and the flash is emitting light for 1/16,000th of a second, I'm actually lighting the subject for a briefer period of time than the shutter is open. So would it matter if I changed my shutter speed to a 1/125th? No, it wouldn't. The flash output is the same because it's still producing light for the same period of time. As a result, changing shutter speed does not change the exposure on a subject lit by strobing equipment until you reach high-speed sync, and that is a subject for a different video. Initially, changing shutter speed doesn't change exposure on a subject lit by a strobing piece of equipment. So we can't use that. What about ISO? Well, if I'm working with strobing equipment, generally speaking, I'm already shooting at 100 ISO. If I am working with strobing equipment outside to fill shadows, I'm at 100 ISO. If I'm indoors in a studio, I'm at 100 ISO. So there's no point in describing light by a value that we don't change. But aperture remains important. It changes the amount of light in the exposure on a subject lit by a flash, and we can use a great variety of apertures in strobing exposures. As a result, the standard for talking about light in a strobing environment or any lit, artificially lit environment was aperture at a distance. So we, to this day, talk about any light source as an aperture at a distance. Even video lights are commonly discussed as apertures at distances, though you do see a little bit more wiggle room in that particular realm of shooting. So the brightness of a light source is not a fixed characteristic. It is relative to the distance between a subject and, of course, the light source. Now, let's get back to understanding the way that light fall-off works. It's not uncommon for people to say that a light gets dimmer the farther away it is from a subject. This is technically nonsense, and the reason is for really interesting reasons having to do with physics. Light waves do not experience the passing of time. They do not age. And so as a result, they can't actually get dimmer over the course of time. This is part of relativity. So instead of saying that a light source gets dimmer, it's more accurate to say that it disperses. This should make intuitive sense. Take a flashlight, turn it on, and leaning against a wall. You'll see very bright light in a narrow cone right next to the light source, and it will spread outwards and get dimmer as it travels up the wall. This is the essence of light dispersion and light fall-off. Light doesn't get dimmer, but it does spread outward. As a result, fewer light waves hit a subject at greater distances, and as a result of that, they are lit less. That is the essence of inverse square law. Inverse square law is actually the mathematical structure we have to describe how light gets dimmer at greater distances. And it works something like this. Have a light source and a subject, and there's some exposure between the two. Then double the distance. The light now hitting the subject is not half its original value, but 1/4. So if I have a light and a subject at, let's say, 2 meters apart, and the exposure is f8, double the distance, and now I have to set my camera to f4. Why? Because that is 1/4 the amount of light as f8. So an f8 light is going to be 2 stops brighter than an f4 light, meaning it's 400% brighter. We learned the stop system talking about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, but it is also important and super relevant when talking about light sources, especially since we describe them as apertures. Describe apertures at distances, and that is the nature of brightness itself. Move a light farther away, it gets dimmer. But please note that if I have a light source very close to a subject and I move at a very small distance, I'll get more noticeable changes than if I have a light source farther away from a subject and I make the same amount of movement and change in distance. It will not dramatically affect exposure. Take a light source and put it a foot away from somebody and then move it 6 inches back. The exposure on the subject will change. Put that light source 3 meters away and move it 6 inches. It makes no noticeable difference. You can prove this for yourself. Go to the nearest park and go to one end of the park and find an exposure that's appropriate for that area. And now walk all the way across the park. Let's say it's a quarter mile. You walk a quarter mile away and you build an exposure. It's probably exactly the same, unless you're under a tree. If you think about it, you're a quarter of a mile farther away from the sun, depending on Earth orientation, but let's imagine you really did move a quarter of a mile away from the sun. Your exposure is the same. This is not because the sun is immune to the laws of physics, but it's actually because you're at such a great distance from the sun that a quarter of a mile is the equivalent of 6 inches in our previous analogy. In our upcoming videos, we're going to understand how we can use the idea of size of light and distance to counterbalance each other, and how to control the quality of light on the face. Thanks for joining me here today. We're going to have some fun talking about light and lighting. This is a subject matter I care about a lot. I hope that you take a look at some of my other videos. There's going to be some links on the screen here. Give us a like, give us a subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.